as a great person who has taken in from great people, another person who later in your career you got very close to is the former president of the United States, George W. Bush. And in your position at the Bush Institute, and even just through being in the energy industry and everything else, you got to know him along the way. But is there something you can share with people? Forget George W. Bush as president of the United States, but George W. Bush as a human, as a person. What could you tell people that they might not be able to glean from newspaper articles or books?
I'd say that President Bush and Richard Rainwater had a lot of similarities. Frankly, that's how I met President Bush back in the 80s, was through Richard, when then I could call him by his first name, but President Bush was the co-managing partner of the Rangers. And so we had that relationship as friends before he went off to run for governor. And so I knew him in that context. As president, he's the same person. His presidency got hijacked in many ways by 9/11. It was, think about it, that was 8 months after he took office, and his whole transition was delayed because of the Florida recount. And so they were just, in the process of getting although they had a lot of their cabinet and administration people filled, they were still getting started. And then all of a sudden 9/11 hit. And so, it was Herculean what he was able to do in rallying his team and his people. And the loyalty that he instilled in the people around him was just stunning. And the kind of person he is, he's a casual person, but he's a serious person. And he's got a fantastic sense of humor, and he cares deeply about the people who work around him. That EQ, he's got about the highest EQ of anybody I've ever met, about like Richard Rainwater. And so there's a lot of similarities there. But just a quality individual that you feel loyalty to and respect for. Those are great qualities to be around and to hope a little bit rubs off on you.
Yeah, you've been so kind to me in so many ways. And as you know, I have all these visitors who come to Dallas because we're a global law firm, and they'll come and I'll take them by the Presidential Library. And there's one thing you've shown me, I think it's twice now. You come down, you run the whole show and you take your time to come down. And you always go to one exhibit from 9/11. I don't know if you're going to remember what I'm talking about, but you go to one exhibit that really reflects what President Bush, his center. Can you talk a little bit about that if I've connected with you on what that is?
Sure. The George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum side of our building, where the museum is in the 9/11 section, we have a very nice, respectful, but informative montage of the week of 9/11, what happened for that next 10 days. And underneath that is a digital touchscreen of his agenda from 9/11. Every day for the president is scripted down to the minutes. So he knows what's scheduled. They might say private time or whatever, but it's very well scripted. And so he has a record of every day. So his record for that day it's just an amazing day. For the people who won't be able to make it, think about this. Put yourself in this person's shoes. Because to me, this is what's so impressive. Stunningly impressive. President Bush woke up in Sarasota, Florida, went for a jog that morning. The last thing he thought of when he woke up was that in about an hour, we're going to get attacked by terrorists. And I'm going to end up flying around the country in Air Force One and then ending up in Nebraska and then coming back to D.C. to a Pentagon. You think about being the commander in chief in that role. Put yourself in that shoe. He's supposed to go in and talk to some lower schoolers about an education, it's an education initiative, and he's going to read to lower schoolers, and it's a made-for-media kind of event. And it starts at 9:00. Well, at 8:46, the first plane hit the first tower. They were briefed walking into that room. And so he was briefed that something had happened, but they were still in the fog at that moment, not knowing what it was. And so at 9 a.m., and President Bush, everybody who knows him, he is very punctual. So at 9 a.m., he's starting with the kids. At 9:02, the second plane hit the second World Trade Center tower. At 9:05, Andy Card, his chief of staff, walks in the back of the room. President Bush knows something is up. And so at 9:05, your chief of staff, Andy Card, whispers in your ear. And what Andy Card said was, a second plane has hit the second tower. America's under attack. He's whispering in his ear. And there's a fantastic photograph of Andy Card in his ear, and President Bush's, the expression on his face was just, not on my watch. Okay, it was a serious look, but it wasn't a scared look, but it was a serious look. It was a famous photograph. But to put yourself in the shoes of President Bush, where you're the commander in chief and somebody just said America's under attack, 9:05. At 9:14, he gets up from that chair to go into the other room. Now, 9 minutes, if you and I sat here for 9 minutes, it would seem like an eternity. Imagine if somebody just told you America's under attack for 9 minutes, right? And you're the commander in chief. But he had that instinct. And this is what's so amazing about President Bush as a leader. Intuitively, he knew the world's going to be watching me. And the American president does not run and does not get rattled. And that instinct took over. He also knew that people outside are going to be mobbing him with questions. So he needed to let his staff do the work, gather what they could. And maybe because his father had been president, maybe because he was not that unfamiliar, I guess, with the tools of the presidency and just what the office of the presidency meant and means. And he said a million times that the office of the presidency of the United States is more important than the occupant of the seat. And so he understood that. And then his day took off. While he's on Air Force One, this is what was amazing to me. So he fluctuated between immediately calling Secretary Rice, and he called Governor Pataki, and he called Giuliani, and he called Vice President Cheney, and he's calling, all of the people around the establishment to figure out what is going on. He stops to make sure the Secret Service goes and gets his daughters. One was at Yale, one was at UT, and so the Secret Service went and got them. He's trying to call his wife, and First Lady Laura Bush was in Ted Kennedy's office, Senator Kennedy, and had been rushed down to underneath the Senate, and then she had to be found, and there were communications issues on Air Force One, and he's getting very frustrated. And then in the middle of it, he stops and he calls his parents. And he says to his parents, where are you? And they said, oh, we're in Bloomfield, Wisconsin. And he said, what are you doing there? President Bush 41 said, because you grounded our plane, and then in the middle of the day, he's in and around these conversations with national security and with defense. And then he stops and he calls Ted Olson. Ted Olson was the Solicitor General in the Bush versus Gore election Supreme Court recount dispute. Ted Olson's wife happened to be on the airplane that crashed into the Pentagon. And then at the end of the day, the whole end of the day, back to Omaha, then he's back to D.C., and he says, we're going back to D.C. People didn't want him to go back. It wasn't safe. He said, the American president is going to sleep in his own bed tonight. That is important. So he was trying to talk to his family. He finally got in touch with his daughter, Barbara, literally about 15 or 20 minutes before he was on national TV at 8 o'clock that night. And so when I look at that day as a whole, what's so stunning is you look at all that and think there was no script. This was probably the last thing on his mind that was going to happen when he woke up that morning. But yet during the day, he was a president, he was a commander in chief, he was a leader, he was a father, he was a son, he was a husband, and he was a friend. When I look at that, my respect, I always have a lot of respect for him. I want everybody to study that, because that, to me, that 18-hour period, we all have unscripted moments. Right now in the COVID crisis, I bet if we all sat down a year ago and said, think about your doomsday scenarios, think about, where we might be a year from now, and think about what could happen to our business. Okay. Yeah. People were predicting maybe we're in late stage of an expansion. There's going to be a recession, maybe Everybody's going to have different scenarios. I doubt somebody would have said, well, maybe it'll be a global pandemic and we'll all be shut down. And we'll go from full employment in February to depression level unemployment by May. I promise you, nobody would have said that, right? So that's 9/11. That's the day of September 11th, 2001. And what President Bush, the way he carried himself, the way he led the country, the words that came out of his mouth, the actions that he did, in my mind, define a person, defined him. And that principled leadership, is what comes out in unscripted moments. And this was completely unscripted. And we all have that in our life. The biggest takeaway for me right now is to think about that. All this is, guys, is an unscripted moment. We all know how to deal with, oh, my business is up 4% this year. Oh, my business is down 3% this year. Oh, this is what's happening. We all know how to deal with that. That's easy. It's not fun. It may be fun, may not be fun. But right now, we're in an unscripted moment. Those are the special needs that we all have at moments like this to get through. And that's where President Bush's experience, I think, is really so valuable. And that's the big lesson for me. I know that was long-winded, Craig, but
No, it was, listen, there is no interrupting that story. I've heard it 4 times, and I assume in my study here, the temperature must have gone down because I got chills. I mean, it's such a great story. And for those who visit this beautiful presidential library, it's an iPad you will totally miss if you don't look at it. And it's got minute by minute detail of President Bush's day, some of which is still classified to this day. And Ken, I think it's very special for people to hear you tell that story beginning to end. I'm struck with the equanimity. I mean, you hear equanimity come through over and over, these unscripted moments. Either we can freak out and overreact to everything, or we can think with some clarity of thought. It's so powerful.